Thank you very much. I would like to thank for the invitation, as well as on behalf of the faculty I represent, I would like to thank our French friends from Orléans for the continuing cooperation with our faculty. Thank you. I owe you two apologies. The first one is, as you see, I've already started offending those walls by using a barbaric language from the other side of La Manche, which the barbarians, for some unknown reason, call the English Channel. I'm sorry, the truth is that if I started to speak French, it would be even more offensive. So, the second apology pertains to what I'm going to talk about, because I won't be talking about the law. I will rather try to say a few things from the perspective of cognitive science and philosophy, but it is my hope that this short analysis will be helpful in understanding an aspect of what the Constitution is, how it organizes our experience as lawyers, and see from a different angle the importance of what a constitution is, even if it is only a myth. So I'm going to speak about the myth of constitution, and every myth or every fairy tale begins with a long time ago. And I also want to begin with a long time ago, but it's even longer than in a typical fairy tale. So it's not 1,000 years ago, it's not 10,000 years ago, it's not even 100,000 years ago. It's more like millions of years ago. What happened back then? The simple statement is that our evolutionary ancestors raised from their knees and adopted an erect or upright posture. There are at least 30 different hypotheses of how this happened. One of the most persuasive is the so-called amphibian generalist theory, which says that the upright posture began in a wooded habitat. The forests were not far from a shore, where our early ancestors, along with their arboreal habits, walked and waded in shallow waters, finding rich food with little investment. Now, what does the upright posture or the erect posture have to do with constitution? Looking at what's going on, and from your point of view, you may think one of two things. The first, that I'm crazy, trying to connect our bodily position with constitution, but then I hope you will treat me with empathy. The other option is that you consider me a postmodern philosopher. In Paris, it's a good thing, I believe, because then you will say, we don't understand this guy, but he's brilliant. That's how I understand postmodernism. I hope I'm neither. I hope that I'm not crazy and I'm not postmodern. The first link between the upright or erect posture and constitution can be found in a theory of cognitive metaphors. This is a theory elaborated by George Lakoff, Mark Johnson, and other linguists who asked a very important question. How can we understand abstract concepts? Law is filled with abstract concepts. So instead of speaking of particular objects, we speak of movable and immovable property, and so on and so on. So we use abstract concepts all the time. But how do we understand them? Well, cognitive science has quite a good understanding of how we understand concrete concepts. For instance, when I say Professor Leroy has switched off my microphone, a cognitive scientist will say, well, you understand this particular sentence, quite a concrete sentence describing a concrete event, by simulating it in your brain. So the same neural circuits which are active when you see Professor Leroy switching off someone's microphone are active when you only imagine this situation, but also when you hear the sentence in which someone describes this very event. The problem is with abstract concepts. How do we understand abstract language? We just cannot play in our minds some, for instance, abstract mathematical equation. And the answer to that is, one of the answers is provided by Lakoff and Johnson. They say that we understand abstract concepts by using metaphorical mappings. So a metaphor is not a literary device, a purely linguistic device. It's something which goes on in our minds, and it's a kind of mechanisms which takes the inferential structure of the concrete domain and maps it onto the abstract domain. And there are many very beautiful experiments which show how it works. For instance, there is an experiment by Lera Boroditsky and her colleagues concerning the notion of crime. So there are two different, only slightly different descriptions of the fact that crimes rise in a small town. In one of those descriptions, the crime is compared to a wild beast. In the other description, it is compared to a virus. And then the participants, after reading those descriptions, are asked to evaluate what to do in this situation, how to reduce the crime. And those who read about crime as a virus say, well, it needs to be treated in one way or another. Those who read about crime as a wild beast say, well, this needs to be tamed. This needs to be stopped right now. It's not a long treatment, it's a quick action. So only two words and completely different outcomes when it comes to the assessment of what to do. But of course there are more important metaphors. This is just a simple example. There are more fundamental metaphors. And one of those metaphors is strictly connected with the way we stand, our posture. This is the up and down metaphor. And we use this metaphor everywhere. For instance, we use happy, up for happy and down for sad. So I'm feeling up, or they boosted my spirits. We use the metaphor that conscious is up and unconscious is down. Like when we say get up, wake up, he fell asleep, he dropped off to sleep, he's under hypnosis. More is up, less is down. The number of books printed each year keeps going up. The number of errors he made is incredibly low. Good is up, bad is down. Things are looking up. Or we hit a peak last year, but it's been downhill ever since. Things are at an all-time low. He does high-quality work. Or the rational is up, the emotional is down. Like the discussion fell to the emotional level, but I raised it back up to the rational plane. Or we put our feelings aside and had a high-level intellectual discussion of the matter. He couldn't rise above his emotions. As you can see, in very different domains we use this metaphor, up and down. And it is used not only in everyday language. It is important in many domains, in mathematics, morals, social interactions, speaking about emotions and so on and so on. But of course, it's also crucially important for law. I believe we cannot imagine law without thinking in terms of hierarchies. I try to do it, maybe my imagination is quite limited, but I cannot imagine thinking of law without hierarchies, without the hierarchy of legal norms, or without the hierarchy of legal acts, or judicial instances, and so on and so on. The law is a hierarchical phenomenon. Now, there is another problem. There is another fear, a deeply rooted mental fear we have, which can be expressed as the horror infinity, the horror of the infinity. The mechanisms of up-down is self-reproducing. So we say that something is up, something is down. We can always ask what is even above the up. And we can go on and on and on like that. So what we need sometimes is to close this system. And it is a well-known discussion in legal theory. Probably the most famous exposition of, on the one hand, this fear, and on the other, the problems connected with it, is Hans Kelsen's pure theory of law. If you remember Hans Kelsen, he says, well, we cannot have the hierarchy going in infinity. What we need is a closure, and this closure is provided by what he calls the Grundnorm, the basic norm. The problem is that when you look at how he describes the basic norm, the Grundnorm, you cannot understand what he's trying to say, really. Because he says that the Grundnorm is the presupposed norm, or a presupposition, or a norm included in a supposition, juristic hypothesis, ultimate hypothesis of positivism, ultimate ground of the validity of the legal system, thought norm, genuine fiction, judiciological constitution, constitution in a transcendental logical sense, transcendental logical concept, a transcendental logical condition of the interpretation in legal sciences, and so on and so on. Two things transpire from this. The first one is that it is something which closes the system, and we are happy because there is no infinity. On the other hand, it is something fictional. It's not real. It is something we need to assume, but it's only an assumption. So the ultimate grounds of the validity of law are fictional. I think it was best expressed by the greatest French philosopher. Who would that be? Michel de Montaigne, I think. De Montaigne says famously, laws are often made by fools, and even more often by men who fall in equity because they hate equity, but always by men, vain authorities who can resolve nothing. So how can we give the law any credence? How can we believe in any authority of law? Montaigne's answer is simple. He says that every system of law bases the truth of its justice upon legal fictions. Now laws remain respected not because they are just, but because they are laws. This is the mystical basis for their authority. They have no other. Of course, you can disagree with Montaigne, but he says an important thing. He says that when we look deep enough, or when we go high enough in this hierarchy, we find something which is not purely rational anymore. We find something which is, he says, mystical. This is the only appearance of the word mystical in the entire oeuvre of Montaigne. But we can also say you find there something mythical, like in the ancient distinction between mythos and logos. And now the final part of what I'm going to say is about the nature of this myth. We need the myth, but what is this myth? And here I want to refer you to a famous book by, this time, one of the better Polish philosophers of the 20th century, Leszek Kołakowski. In the 1960s, he wrote a book entitled The Presence of Myth. And in this book, he tries to show that all major areas of our experience are not purely rational. Ultimately, we need the mythical. But the myth, in Kołakowski's terms, means that it is not a description of physical reality, it is something that creates a reality which neither explains nor is determined by the realities of experience. One of the biggest myths, according to Kołakowski, is our belief in reason. Reason cannot justify itself. There are many circular, so there are even some logical proofs which can be interpreted as showing that reason cannot justify itself. But there are myths everywhere. And those myths are very important. They perform a number of functions, and without those functions performed by those myths, we wouldn't survive as coherent societies. And I believe that we can speak of three kinds of the functions performed by a myth. The first one is hermeneutic. Myths help us to understand the world. They organize our experience. If you remember the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, he speaks of three regulatory ideas of God, world, and the soul. And there is nothing which corresponds to them in reality. These are just concepts which organize our inner experiences, our experience of the external world, and the combination thereof. Without those ideas, regulatory ideas, without those myths, our experience of the world would be a shattered nonsense. The second role performed by myth is heuristic. Myth is a seat of imagination. I believe that we downplay the role of imagination both in our everyday lives and in the law. If we think of a lawyer, we think of someone who uses pure reason, deductive arguments, and so on and so on. But if you consider what we do every day, we use imagination. We try to imagine different kinds of cases and ask, what would we do in such circumstances? Imagination is something which is indispensable for dealing with legal problems, but it cannot be done in a purely rational way. We need something which makes our imagination run, and these are myths. Finally, there is the axiological function of any myth. Reason itself cannot generate values. It's only through this kind of myth that values can enter our discourse. It follows that first, the myth of a constitution is not an isolated myth. It belongs to a bunch of myths which make up the idea of the rule of law, of what the law is generally. And so this is the first thing. The second is that the myth of the Constitution is a tool for creative solving of legal problems. Without this kind of myth, we would be unable to solve legal problems, maybe apart from simple or algorithmic ones. Finally, Constitution as a myth is not something to be only contemplated. It is an idea to be acted upon. And we can act upon something we believe in, which is underpinned with values and is not a purely rational or logical construct. So my conclusion is that if we get rid of the myth of the Constitution, we would be unable to interpret law, apply it, and follow it. In other words, Constitution, even if mythical or mystical or metaphorical, is indispensable for the existence of law, and it is indeed a myth worth defending. Thank you.